Hello, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Peter, for inviting me here to talk to you about my work and help you understand the context for this exhibition more. And so, some years ago, I wrote this book on Japanese Buddhist art and architecture from the 17th century to the present, which is still a topic largely overlooked by scholars of both pre-modern or modern Japanese art history and Buddhist art. And Peter and Morgan had directed me to situate the two artists who are featured in this exhibition in the context of Buddhist art of their time, which was a pivotal, transformative era for Buddhism and its related visual culture as Japan entered the modern world. And my task is a formidable one, and I will confess to having a great deal of trouble trying to figure out how to frame the presentation in a coherent way. My problem stems from the fact that both were devout Buddhists, Rengetsu and Nantenbō, although they lived very differently, belonging to different sects, creating their art apart from the visual requirements of Buddhism's formal institutions, even though they were both ordained into the clergy. And this, though, provides an opportunity to show Buddhism's pervasive influences on Japanese society from the standpoint of how it touched individuals very differently, even its clergy, and how devout individuals resorted to unorthodox means to reach the public. My talk introduces the Buddhist world of their time and its diverse visual culture, including monuments and imagery created for the faith's public institutions, and I hope it raises questions more also about how personal expressions of faith relate to these more public faces of Buddhism's material culture. Neither Rengetsu nor Nantenbō were professional Buddhist image makers. Their art was not created for worship halls. They were both self-taught amateurs and created art as personal expressions of their devoutness. In the case of Rengetsu, however, beyond her love of writing, she needed to make art to earn a living, which she did together with professionals. In contrast, the art of Nantenbō, an institutional leader, also served as informal didactic teaching tools. So I'm taking these issues as a starting point to evaluate how we today conceive of the parameters of historic Buddhist art and its artists. To understand the Buddhist world of late Edo and Meiji Japan and its visual culture requires awareness of complex interrelated factors that include a number of different points, and I've sort of distilled them down into 10 major points. One, being alert to the fact that how we regard pre-modern Japanese Buddhism and its art today, generally through the study of sectarian traditions and their own related visual culture, may not be how the religion was actually practiced, which can be variously described as pluralistic, syncretic, or trans-sectarian. Two, realizing that Buddhist art was created by a wide range of makers, including professionals and amateurs, lay followers, and clerics. Three, appreciating that differences exist in visual requirements for Buddhist art made by and intended for sophisticated, well-educated urban residents and Japan's rural population. Four, taking social status, education, and income levels into account when assessing personal and public expressions of faith. And five, knowing knowing that the discrete cultural climates of Japan's two major geographic centers of Kyoto or Edo, Tokyo, affected modes of artistic expression and the function of sites of worship in them, reflective of the city's populations and makeup and histories. 6, recognizing that Buddhism's vast visual culture encompasses many differences and distinctions can and should be made between arts made for institutions and those created by individuals as personal expressions of faith. 7, acknowledging the weight of the past on Buddhist beliefs, institutional structures, and related visual culture, as we've already heard discussions of that earlier today. 9, observing that in Japan, boundaries between the religious and secular spheres are often blurred. And finally, 10, taking personal preferences of individuals into account. And on top of all that, there are some broader salient questions that also should be considered, which include when and why did pre-modern Buddhist visual materials come to be considered as art? And why do scholars privilege early Buddhist art and architecture over that of the Edo and Meiji periods, and focus their studies mainly on Buddhist arts created for its formal institutions? And how is the art of amateurs considered in the context of Buddhist studies of art and religion? And should Rengetsu be considered a Buddhist artist? And lastly, why is Zen brushwork encompassing calligraphy and painting by Zen monks from the 17th century to the present, which is known as Zenga, generally often omitted from the early canon of Buddhist art? So I think a good place to start my discussion is with the invention of Buddhist art. Defining Buddhism's material culture as art is closely associated with the invention of nomenclature for fine arts, a term coined in the Meiji period. The Japanese first invented the word fine arts, bijutsu, in 1873 when preparing for the nation's participation in the Vienna International Exposition. And this word paired bi, the abstract notion of beauty, with jutsu, the second character in the pre-modern word geijutsu, or cultivated skill, a word borrowed from China, where it had been used to describe skills to be mastered by scholar intellectuals. Before that, makers of various arts and crafts were defined broadly as shokunin, makers who possessed special skills, although famous and talented painters and calligraphers in the employ of high status groups in society, which were the samurai and the court, were accorded higher and separate status from other artisans. In the West, the fine arts of painting and sculpture were more highly regarded than all types of crafts. Around 1873, the words chokoku, sculpture, and crafts, koge, were also devised to follow these Western historical divisions, to define Japanese artists as equivalent to their counterparts in the West when Japan sought equal status with Western powers. Buddhist carvers, known as bushi, had created most Buddhist sculptors for temples prior to the Edo period as freelance artists in family-run workshops. In the Meiji period, some reinvented themselves as modern sculptors. Among the earliest to do so was Takamura Koen, who became a professor of sculpture at the new Tokyo University of the Arts. His aged monkey, now in the Tokyo National Museum, exemplifies his transformation. He created it for the 1893 Chicago World's Columbian Exposition, where it won a prize. Notably, though, he did continue to create very traditional Buddhist icons for temples, this one a gate guardian for the important pilgrimage site of Zenkoji, completed in 1819 together with one of his disciples. Incidentally, today, one of only the art of pre-modern Buddhist sculptors and painters is regularly displayed in art museums and collected as art. The work of modern Buddhist icon carvers and painters that are still made today are not. Rather, their art is defined as specialized types of traditional handicraft industries designed for devotional use by religious practitioners for temples and home altars, and not for display in museums and fine art galleries. In the Meiji period, though, other innovative sculptors began creating non-traditional Buddhist imagery for temples. Among the most unusual are the Buddhist statues composed of cremated remains of devotees, Okotsu Butsu, at the Osaka Jodosek Temple Ishinji. This temple was where local kabuki actors were buried and where the stupendously popular kabuki actor from Edo, Ichikawa Danjiro VIII, was also buried after committing suicide in Osaka in 1854. Because of Danjiro's interment, Ishinji achieved national fame, and hordes of his fans desired to be buried at this temple as well. By the 1880s, there were over 50,000 burial urns that the temple didn't know what to do with, and so the head priest at the time came up with this innovative idea to commission a Japanese sculptor trained in Western techniques of plaster and bronze casting to mix the ashes with plant resin to create these Buddhist forms. And they're still being made today. About once every 10 years, they have to make a new one. And this building is now full, and the head priest is trying to figure out what to do, where to put the new ones. Meanwhile, in Kobe in 1891, after 2 years of construction, Nofukuji erected a bronze Daibutsu, Great Buddha, in its temple courtyard, intended from the beginning to be installed there and not inside a Buddha hall, as all large statues had been previously. They did this at the insistence of a local donor who was a wealthy Kobe paper merchant. 10 abbots of various Buddhist sects joined public citizens to attend a 7-day eye-opening ceremony marking its consecration. Walter Weston, an English Anglican missionary then residing in Kobe, illustrated and wrote about it in the opening section of his popular book on mountain climbing in Japan several years later, and he commented especially on its electric light placed where normally one would find the Buddha's third eye. This and its outdoor placement attests to its more modern function as a civic rather than wholly spiritual monument, and indeed it quickly became a tourist attraction. By the beginning of the Meiji period, due to economic conditions, warfare that ended the Tokugawa regime, and natural disasters, the physical condition of even the most important old temples had deteriorated. The situation was exacerbated by the intentional destruction of temples early in the Meiji period, when Buddhist institutions and their clergy were widely viewed negatively and too closely aligned with the old military rulers. One of the early policies of the new Meiji government separated Buddhist and Shinto shrines, ushering and many temples were destroyed then and turned into shrines, such as the one pictured here. Others left in dire straits, as evident in this old photo of the important Nara temple, Tosho Daiji. Soon, though, leaders had a change of heart, recognizing that Western nations valued religious sites and their treasures as national symbols of cultural identity. Government leaders in the early 1870s who had toured Europe returned home, and in 1872 began surveying old temples and shrines, starting with Horyuji and other old temples in Nara. Other surveys soon followed, including one in 1884, in which American Ernest Fenollosa and his protege Ōtagaki Kakuzo participated. Still lacking funds, even Horyuji, Japan's oldest surviving temple, was forced in 1878 to make a deal with the imperial household to gift some 319 temple treasures to it in exchange for funds to reconstruct the temple compound. These treasures were transferred to the new National Museum in Ueno Park in 1882. Several decades later, in 1897, Japan established its national treasure system to safeguard and celebrate the nation's historical cultural properties, especially at first its religious sites and their objects and statuary. They enacted 2 laws, one for protection of old temples and shrines, and the other to designate significant arts, mainly religious paintings and sculptures, in these institutional collections as national treasures, kokuho, and a slightly less exalted category, important cultural properties, chuyo bunkazai. These laws created a funding source for worthy temple restoration projects. And you can see the buildings designated in these categories on this color-coded map of Horyuji. Horyuji possesses 18 national treasure structures, the most at any Japanese temple, and 18 national treasure sculptures, which ties for first place with Kofukuji, another national ancient Nara temple. Among the projects the government funded was a restoration of the Phoenix Hall of the Byodo-in, overseen by Ōtagaki Kakuzo, who removed 10 damaged heads of Apsara, Buddhist angels, and replaced them with replicas. 3 were known to have been sold in the 1930s, and one of these is now at Harvard. Another more significant reconstruction project of the early 20th century, when Nantenbō lived, took place at Tofukuji in Kyoto, the head temple of a different Rinzai sect branch than his Myoshinji. Because of an acute scarcity of wooden logs, when the main temple hall at Tofukuji burned down in 1881, its replacement, which was constructed between 1917 and 1934, was smaller than before. Still, it stands today as the largest wooden building erected in the Showa period. The large cypress wood logs used for its pillars were imported from Taiwan, available because Japan had annexed that Chinese island in 1895 as part of its victory negotiations after the Sino-Japanese War. However, despite a successful fundraising campaign that lasted from 1908 to 1917, and as a new building project rather than a restoration, Tofukuji's building did not qualify for state support and had to be privately funded. The transportation costs for the timber from Taiwan were so great that the temple could not have afforded it. However, the government felt that reconstruction of this important temple was so important that it arranged for the Japanese Navy to transport the lumber on its ships at no cost back to the temple. The project then reflects the deep connection between Meiji leaders and the Rinzai Zen sect generally. Concurrent with these restorations, and ranking of treasures, a Buddhist organization, the Japanese Association of True Beauty of Buddhism, Nihon Bukkyo Shinbi Kyokai, which had offices within a sub-temple of Kenninji, the oldest Zen temple in Kyoto, began to promote the connection between Buddhism and sacred beauty. They had the support of the government officials, especially Kuki Ryuichi, who was director of the Tokyo National Museum from 1888, helped craft the cultural heritage preservation laws. In 1899, Kuki wrote the preface to the first 20 volumes of a deluxe series of bilingual books that the organization published, which introduced ancient Buddhist sculpture and painting to both Japan and the Western world, a testament to the close alliance of Buddhist intellectuals and government organizations. Not surprisingly, early Buddhist icon paintings were the first acquisitions of the new National Museum. The process cemented the status of these works as national treasures in the canon of Japanese art. And incidentally, Kuki was also the first to write about connections between Zen, art, and Japan, linking Zen to the nation's empire-building programs, which foreshadowed the writings of D.T. Suzuki about Zen's modern universalism. Thus, the traditional canon of Japanese Buddhist art created in the Meiji period of the latter part of the 19th century focused on Buddhist arts created for elite patrons, the imperial family, courtiers, high-ranking samurai warriors from the 7th through the 16th century. Japanese conceivers of this canon excluded later material because many were created for commoners, not intended for display inside worship halls, but in temple courtyards, which were non-traditional sites of worship. And they were often filled, as in this photo, with sekibutsu, popular stone statues. Later Buddhist art was also populated by non-traditional folk deities, such as the seven gods of good fortune, a grouping that coalesced in the 17th century. By emphasizing Buddhist art and architecture prior to the Edo period, Japanese scholars reflected scholarly presumptions about the aesthetic superiority of early Japanese Buddhist cultural artifacts and an associated decline in Edo period Buddhist institutions, believing them and their clergy to be degenerate, corrupt, devoid of morals. And they also sought to demonstrate to the world that, unlike other non-Western nations, the Japanese possessed an ancient, sophisticated society and cultural heritage equal to that of Western powers going back to the 7th century, with Horyuji, the world's oldest surviving wooden building, and its treasures as a starting point. As with much of the historic European artistic canon that emphasizes arts and architecture created in the service of the Christian church, for rulers and other affluent and influential patrons, the Japanese Buddhist canon focuses on art and religious structure dignified by their great age, by their creation in the old imperial and political capitals of Nara, Kyoto, and Kamakura, by the elite status of their patrons, and by their association with identifiable and prestigious professional artists and their artistic lineages. Like their European counterparts, these arts were technically sophisticated, rare, and expensive. These early pre-modern temples were also made in the distant past, as were the great religious monuments of Europe, prior to Western civilizations turned towards secularism in the 19th century, a time when Japan also earnestly wished to be considered as a modern secular nation equal to Western powers. Not surprisingly, Westernization and industrialization, as the steam engine in the print at left, were dominant themes in Meiji period ukiyo-e prints. Nevertheless, Buddhist subjects sometimes sneaked in, as in this painting at the lower right by the esteemed painter Kawanabe Kyosai, a devout Buddhist who painted images of the Bodhisattva Kannon daily. In one page of an album he painted for a patron to aid in the salvation of the person's deceased young daughter, he included a steam engine, new to Japan that very year, carrying the child to paradise with Kannon and his retinue hovering above. Surviving temples from the Edo period reveal the temple construction and accompanying image then, despite Meiji leaders' misgivings, were indeed significant and created for a variety of purposes. Then, the military bureaucrats of the Tokugawa shoguns modeled their administration on select aspects of Chinese Confucian philosophy to demonstrate their mandate to rule and make sure everyone knew their role in society. They also sought to wield power over Buddhist institutions' spheres of influence in various ways to validate their hegemony over both the political and religious spheres as well. Most significantly, also, they required the populace to register at Buddhist temples. During their rise to power, and as a result of earthquake and fire damage in the 17th century, many temples had been destroyed, so they embarked in an ambitious and expensive reconstruction process. For example, they rebuilt the mortuary temple Hokoji in Kyoto, which is no longer extant, which was first erected by their vanquished foes, the Toyotomi family, as a public relations effort to demonstrate their compassion. They rebuilt many of the halls at the Jodo Pure Land sect temple headquarters of Chionin in Kyoto, and they rebuilt damaged famous sectarian head temples and pilgrimage sites such as Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto. By the 18th century, these massive projects has resulted in shogunal coffers being depleted, and funding for subsequent Buddhist building projects increasingly came from regional daimyo, samurai feudal lords, and the general populace. Although, as the era progressed, widespread financial woes resulted in fewer and fewer new temple construction and maintenance projects being realized, as did shortages in the supply of wood. And incidentally, the Tokugawa were themselves affiliated with the Jodo sect, and Chionin is also where Rengetsu lived for a time with her stepfather, who was an administrator there. Nevertheless, the shoguns supported Buddhist temples of various sectarian traditions, not just the Jodo. One of the temple projects they helped fund was the construction of a new temple for a new Zen sect in the mid-17th century. Then a group of immigrant Chinese Chan monks founded the Obaku Zen sect and set up their new temple headquarters, Mampukuchi, in Uji, with financial support from often competing factions, the imperial family, the shoguns, various daimyo, and even wealthy merchants. The shoguns hoped that the presence of these Obaku monks and their teachings would mitigate the power of established rinzai institutions whom they were trying to control, and also to revitalize. They wanted the Obaku to help revitalize the teachings of Rinzai Zen, which were widely regarded as spiritually in decline. By virtue of their being Chinese, the Obaku monks were thought to be able to impart authentic Chinese Chan or Zen teachings, despite the fact that their Ming interpretation of Chinese Chan Buddhist tenets, which were more eclectic and syncretic and incorporated Pure Land beliefs and fused elements of Confucianism, Taoism, and folk beliefs. Apart from Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples constructed for the shogun's personal use or rebuilt to demonstrate their benevolence, Mampukuji was one of the most important, significant, wholly new temple construction projects built in the Edo period. Many of the Obaku monks created art informally, both calligraphy and simple ink paintings, for distribution to disciples or for their own enjoyment and display in private chambers as an important form of their spiritual expression. These works sometimes functioned as didactic visual aids that served purposes different from the formal icons inside their worship halls. And they reflected the monks' introspective nature and self-cultivation, and reflected also the values of their Chinese literati heritage. Obaku acceptance in Japan was not limited to elites of Japanese society, those people who admired the Chinese literati. They quickly gained a following throughout the country, and many affiliate Obaku temples were constructed in the provinces and in the city of Edo. The Obaku temple Gohyaku Rakanji, the temple of the 500 Arhats, established in Edo in 1695, demonstrates how major Buddhist patronage shifted at the end of the 17th century from elites to commoners. Although established as a land-grant temple by the 5th shogun, the main visitors which had no parishioners of its own, were commoners. Emblematic of public modes of worship, visitors came to admire views from its exotic and tall spiral hall and inspected the lifelike statues of the 500 Rakan, legendary disciples of the Buddha, who were frequently represented in Obaku statuary and paintings. The appearance of individual statues was said to have been modeled on actual people, enhancing their appeal. Funds to complete this set came from Obaku monks themselves, the shogun's mother, as well as wealthy merchants, but visitors came from all walks of life, and maintenance funds later in the Edo period continued to come from commoners. Obaku influenced later Rinzai sect teachings and art, beginning with the seminal Zen master Hakuin, who revived Zen in the Edo period. He did this through emphasizing meditation focused on koan and his efforts to spread Zen to ordinary people throughout Japan, unlike many prior Rinzai masters who focused on patronage from elites. In order to reach these less well-educated people, he used simple brush paintings of themes they could relate to, like the folk deities, the 7 gods of good fortune, and bold calligraphy. Nantenbō's art is indebted to Hakuin's bold and powerful, often non-traditional images. This change in patronage represents a major shift in Buddhism and its visual culture. New types of non-traditional and folk devotional practices became widespread, with individuals praying to popular deities that may or may not have association with the sectarian traditions to which they belonged. Especially popular was the compassionate bodhisattva Kannon, who was the focus of major pilgrimage circuits, as shown here, and other folk deities like Oni, demons portrayed as mendicant monks, as in this Otsue picture in a popular woodblock print at lower left, who became incorporated into the Buddhist canon to offer protection. Rengetsu often portrayed this figure in her art. One of the main themes in 19th century paintings and ukiyo-e prints was the scenery of famous places, many of these being famous old temples in the old capital of Kyoto that were popular pilgrimage/tourist destinations to which masses of visitors belonging to different sects visited. The fame that these places achieved then helped generate interest in preserving them later and kept interest in Buddhism alive in difficult times. And in Rengetsu's day, Buddhist temples had become bustling venues for entertainment and amusement. In Edo, sumo tournaments, for example, were first held at the Ekoin Temple courtyard in Edo in 1768 to help the temple raise money for its upkeep. By the early 19th century, to engage and respond to the wishes of lay public, artists began creating dramatic, sensationalist Buddhist imagery, including satirical images of famous Buddhist legendary and historical figures, especially Daruma, as seen here, portrayed in popular kabuki play by a famous actor. Professional artists also often brushed universal themes of Buddhist salvation and the terrors of its hells. These sorts of melodramatic themes were featured in both paintings and ukiyo-e prints that were especially popular with Edo townspeople. Kano Kazunobu graphically painted a set of 100 paintings of the 500 rakan for the Edo Jodosek Temple Zojoji, the Tokugawa family mortuary temple, that were displayed on special occasions to the public. And ukiyo-e prints began featuring stories about one of the most heroic Buddhist monks of the past, Nichiren, who founded his namesake sect in the Kamakura period and was also featured in popular kabuki plays into the Meiji period. This was the public world of Buddhism and popular imagery in which Rengetsu lived, but that she eschewed. Her art represents an opposing visual path, as she created quiet, deeply moving poetry, elegant calligraphy, handmade ceramics, and simple paintings that became wildly popular. After initially taking vows at Chionin, she was forced to leave the hermitage there after her father's death, when she was 42. In her youth, as a lady-in-waiting at a castle nearby, she had learned arts appropriate for elite samurai women, including composing waka poetry that she brushed in kana calligraphy. She parlayed these skills into a profession when she found herself having to earn a living after leaving Chionin, and she moved into a district then in Kyoto where artists and writers resided. Rengetsu was a self-taught potter on which she inscribed or carved her own verse, but she had to work with professional artists, professional potters, and assistants to have her wares fired. Many of her pieces were designed for preparing or serving sencha, steeped green leaf tea, that had become quite fashionable then. Sencha had been introduced to Japan by the Obaku monks, whom I mentioned earlier, and popularized in Kyoto by Baisao, an Obaku monk who left the priesthood to peddle tea to the public there, claiming in his Chinese poetry, for which he was also famous, that its benefits included spiritual enlightenment. In Kyoto, this spirit of eccentricity that celebrated individuality was strong due to the influence of free-spirited Chinese literati values that many of its intellectuals ascribed to, and in part learned about from the emigrant Chinese Obaku monks. In fact, Baisao was considered one of the great eccentrics of his day and was included in a celebrated compilation of individuals idolized as Kijin eccentrics, the Kinsei Kijin-den biographies of eccentrics of recent times, published in 1790, and its sequel, which was published in 1798. Profiled in these books were people whose precocity, strangeness, intellectual creativity, or perceived spirituality deemed them worthy of adoration. I like to think that if another sequel would have been compiled after Rengetsu lived, that she would have been included, because she certainly fit the description. Although Baisao did not himself make pottery, his admirers did. One of these was Ueda Akinari, also famous for his, he was a waka poet who was also famous for popular writings, especially ghost tales, who, like Rengetsu, as an amateur potter, made hand-formed sencha vessels in collaboration with professional Kyoto potters. He authored the first book about the Sencha tea ceremony in 1794 that positioned it as superior to Cha-no-yu, the tea ceremony for powdered tea. In some accounts of Rengetsu's life, Akinari is credited as one of her early poetry teachers. His manner of forming pieces generally, and especially this crab-shaped brazier with a poem incised on its backside, prefigures Rengetsu's poetry, which she produced in much larger commercial quantities than he did. Later in life, Rengetsu settled in an hermitage, likely the one she simply brushed it left, at a small Shingansek temple, Jinko Inn, whose abbot, Wada Geshin, she sometimes collaborated with. There she began studying Shingon practice, and it's reflective of the tendency of people of her day to study Buddhism of various sectarian traditions. Like her, Geshin had entered the priesthood only after the death of close family when he was 41. Before that, he had trained as a painter in the Maruyama Shijo tradition. After becoming a priest, he continued to paint, sometimes brushing formal icons and sometimes simple ink paintings of white-robed Kannon Bodhisattva, the latter brushed daily as a personal act of devotion. And some indicates that Rengetsu brushed poetry on some of his paintings of Kannon that were intended for sale to raise money for flood victims. Both Rengetsu and Nantenbō can be viewed as amateur self-taught artists, but in the Japanese and broader East Asian world, they were highly educated individuals whose mastery of fine writing skills in their youth formed the basis of their art. The differences in their writing styles reveals how the spirit of Buddhism touched devout individuals who committed themselves to the clergy in very different ways. In the case of Rengetsu, though, she also worked with professionals to fire her wares, and this cooperation blurred the boundaries between professional and amateur makers. But their art did have some commonalities. Nantenbō followed precedents for Zenga set in the Edo period to include non-Zen themes in his pictorial repertoire, to make some Zen principles understandable to lay followers. And Rengetsu also featured some of the same folk characters in her art, as well as many other themes that had universal appeal. And yet their art looks entirely different, reflective of their temperaments and also their positions. His by necessity and inclination is forceful and large, hers by inclination delicate and diminutive. While the art of Nantenbō is undeniably Buddhist, so too is Rengetsu's, although hers was not tied to sectarian traditions and it wasn't as overt. The themes of her poetry and many of the subjects for her simple paintings cannot be fully appreciated without recognition of the universality of their Buddhist sentiments, and that these were sentiments, as Melissa already mentioned, the poets of ancient Japan had expressed before her. And despite his living in the 20th century, Nantenbō's art is firmly governed in the aesthetics and values of the past, although adapted to connect to modern viewers. Both these artists possess strong personalities, powerful motivations, and innate talent. Pairing them in this exhibition helps us understand two very different aspects of Buddhism's multifaceted visual culture in Japan that flourished alongside the work of professional artists who created icons and other imagery for the pomp and ceremony that supports Buddhism's institutional needs. In conclusion, I find it interesting to contemplate when and why collectors, both in Japan and abroad, became interested in the art of these two individuals. In the case of Rengetsu, her art was so popular that even in her lifetime, fakes were being created. And an imitator worked so closely in her style into the 60s, as Paul has already mentioned, that his works are confused with her own and that of her immediate follower, curatorial. By 1885, she was already being included in books about notable women of the past, and indeed her gender seems to be a strong reason for her fame at that time. Additionally, the Japanese have always admired tragic heroes, and she certainly fits that mold as well. Since she passed away, there's been no abatement in her popularity with collectors. Even early Western collectors of Japanese arts acquired pieces by her, especially her ceramics. The earliest Western collection in which I found her work is the Walters Art Museum, which on their website for this teapot lists makers as both Rengetsu and Koryo with question marks after their names. But in a recently published article, the piece is identified simply as by Rengetsu. I'm inclined to disbelieve it, but I'm awaiting better photos of the base, and I've asked if they have a box for it, but I haven't gotten a response yet. What's fascinating about this piece is that it was acquired in 1878 at the Exposition Universelle in Paris by William Walters, whose collection formed the basis of his namesake museum. The Morse collection of ceramics at the MFA Boston, acquired in 1892 by the museum, also owns two pieces said to be by her. In contrast to early foreign interest in Rengetsu, foreign collectors of Japanese Buddhist art in the latter part of the 19th century had no interest in Zenga. When Westerners like the famous Bostonians Ernest Fenollosa and William Sturgis Bigelow and French collectors Émile Guimet and Henri Cernucci first came to Japan, their deep interest in Buddhism was there, but not Zen. And that led them to collect more traditional statuary and icon painting of the sort found inside temple halls. And here I show Guimet's famous replicas of famous Toji Temple sculpture mandalas that he commissioned for a contemporary sculptor, Buddhist sculptor, to make for his museum. Some other early collectors wound up with forgeries of reworkings of older damaged works sold to them by unscrupulous Japanese dealers. I show two examples of problem pieces I identified when working as a curator at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. As for Nantenbō, collecting his work abroad as art began much more recently in the post-World War II period. Some influential and wealthy Japanese industrialists had began collecting Zenga of the Edo period, particularly works by Hakuin and Sengai, and also some of works by Nantenbō in the late 19th century. But the Zenga boom in the West only began in the 1950s. And the term Zenga itself, Zen painting, first made its appearance in a major exhibition of Edo period Zen monks that toured Europe from 1959 to 1960. And as for Nantenbō here in the US, Paul might know more than I do, but Kurt Gitter, I think, was one of the earliest collectors, and he began collecting. His earliest acquisition of a Nantenbō was 1978. Thank you very much for your attention.